The dust swirled through Pueblo's main street like angry ghosts, and Marianne Kendrick stood on an overturned crate in front of the mercantile, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a story nobody wanted to hear. She spoke of ancient kingdoms and brave knights, of dragons that breathed fire across distant mountains, of princesses who saved themselves without waiting for rescue. The townsfolk hurried past, their boots kicking up red Colorado dirt, their eyes fixed firmly ahead as though acknowledging her presence might somehow infect them with her particular brand of foolishness. It was July of 1878, and Pueblo had no time for fairy tales. The railroad had brought prosperity and practical minds, men who dealt in cattle and silver ore, women who concerned themselves with survival rather than fantasy. Marianne had learned this the hard way over the past 6 months since arriving from Boston, but she couldn't stop herself from trying. Stories lived inside her like wild things desperate for freedom, and every morning she climbed onto that crate and let them loose into the indifferent air. And so the warrior princess stood at the edge of the cliff, Marianne continued, her brown eyes scanning the crowd that wasn't there, knowing that behind her waited an army of 10,000 men, and before her stretched nothing but sky and the promise of wings she wasn't certain she possessed. A woman in a blue calico dress deliberately turned her head away. 2 miners laughed at something between themselves, not even hearing Marianne's words. The blacksmith's hammer rang out like a metronome counting down the seconds of her humiliation. Then she saw him. He sat on the bench outside the post office, a mountain of a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the Rockies themselves. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun, muscles evident even beneath the worn buckskin shirt he wore. Dark hair fell past his collar, tangled and wild, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But his eyes were what stopped her mid-sentence. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch, gray as storm clouds and utterly focused. Marianne faltered, lost her place in the story, then found it again. The warrior princess spread her arms wide, she said, her voice steadier now, directed at this audience of one. And she jumped. The mountain man leaned forward slightly, his massive hands resting on his knees. The wind caught her, fierce and wild, and for a terrible moment she fell. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she thought, this is how it ends. This is how all foolish dreams end, in dust and broken bones and the laughter of those who never dared to try. Marianne's voice grew stronger, feeding off the attention like a plant starved for sunlight. But then something shifted. The air itself seemed to hear her desperate wish, and it lifted her, carried her, gave her the wings she needed. She soared above that army, above the doubters and the cynics, above everyone who had ever told her that girls don't fight and dreams don't matter, and some things are simply impossible. The mountain man's lips curved slightly beneath his beard. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. Marianne finished the story, her heart pounding harder than it should have been for a tale she'd told a dozen times before. When she reached the end, when the princess landed safely on the far side of the mountain and discovered a valley where others like her had gathered, the mountain man stood. He was even larger standing, well over 6 feet of solid muscle and weathered strength. He nodded once, a deliberate acknowledgement, then turned and walked away with the easy gait of a man who belonged to wild places. She watched him disappear around the corner toward the livery stable, and something in her chest felt different than it had that morning. The next day, Marianne almost didn't climb onto her crate. The morning had brought rain, rare for July in Colorado, and the streets were slick with mud. Her landlady, Mrs. Patterson, had suggested over breakfast that perhaps Marianne might consider finding actual employment, the kind that came with wages rather than bemused stares. But the stories were restless inside her, and by noon the rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet sage. She took her position and began a new tale, this one about a sailor who could speak to whales. Within minutes, she saw him again. The mountain man had taken the same bench, his massive frame settled as though he had nothing better to do than listen to a strange woman spin fantasies in the middle of a working town. Marianne's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. She told the story through to its conclusion, how the sailor learned the songs of the deep and discovered that whales remembered everything, every ship that had ever crossed their paths, every storm that had ever raged, every secret the ocean had ever kept. When she finished, the mountain man stood again, but this time he walked toward her instead of away. Up close, he was even more imposing, all corded muscle and weathered skin, but his gray eyes were gentle in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "Name's Marcus Vance," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "I liked your story, Marianne Kendrick." She stepped down from the crate, suddenly aware of how small she was compared to him. She barely reached his shoulder. "You're the first person in 6 months to say that." "Then folks around here are fools." He said it matter-of-factly without heat or judgment. "You got more stories." "Hundreds," Marianne admitted. "Thousands, maybe. They just keep coming." Marcus nodded as though this made perfect sense. "I'll be here tomorrow if you're telling." He left her standing beside her crate, her mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Why did he care about stories when everyone else in Pueblo cared only for gold and cattle and the price of grain? That evening, Marianne asked Mrs. Patterson about Marcus Vance. The older woman's eyebrows rose sharply. "That mountain man. He comes down from the hills maybe once a month for supplies, lives up in the high country trapping and hunting, keeps to himself mostly. Why are you asking?" "He listened to one of my stories today," Marianne said. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Well, I suppose even wild men need something to feed their minds. Just don't go getting any foolish notions. Men like that aren't made for town life or wives or regular society." But Marianne was already full of foolish notions. They were her specialty, after all. Marcus came back the next day and the day after that. Each time, Marianne told a different story, and each time he listened with that same complete attention. She told him about the girl who wove moonlight into cloth, about the king who learned to speak the language of trees, about the fox who fell in love with a star. The rest of Pueblo continued to ignore her, but it didn't matter anymore. She had an audience. On the 5th day, after she'd finished a particularly long tale about a library that existed between moments of time, Marcus approached her crate again. "You hungry?" he asked. Marianne blinked. "I suppose I am. There's a decent place down the street, makes a good stew." He paused and something almost uncertain crossed his weathered features. "Would you take a meal with me?" Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The restaurant was small and plain, the kind of place where railroad workers and miners ate after long shifts. Marcus folded his large frame into a chair that seemed far too delicate for him, and Marianne sat across the scarred wooden table, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been while standing on a crate telling stories to the wind. "How long have you been telling stories?" Marcus asked after they'd ordered. "My whole life," Marianne said. "My mother used to say I came into the world talking and I never stopped. I was a teacher in Boston before I came here. I taught literature and composition to girls at a private school. What brought you to Colorado?" Marianne looked down at her hands. "My parents died last year. Influenza. The school where I taught was run by my father, and when he passed, the board decided they wanted a man in charge. They offered me a small settlement and suggested I might want to make a fresh start somewhere new. My aunt lives in Denver, so I thought I'd try the West. She managed a small smile. Turned out my aunt had exaggerated how close Denver and Pueblo are, and how much demand there is for literature teachers in mining towns. Marcus's gray eyes held sympathy but not pity. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Thank you." Marianne took a breath. "What about you? Mrs. Patterson says you live in the mountains." "Have for about 8 years now. I came out here during the war, served as a scout for the cavalry. When it ended, I couldn't stomach going back east. Too many people, too much noise. The mountains suited me better." He accepted a bowl of stew from the tired-looking waitress and nodded his thanks. "I've got a cabin up near the headwaters of the Arkansas River. Trap beaver and marten in winter, hunt in summer, sell the pelts and meat when I need supplies. Don't you get lonely?" Marcus considered this while he ate. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I got used to my own company, or I thought I had." His eyes met hers. "Your stories, they remind me there's more to the world than just surviving in it. They remind me why surviving matters." Marianne felt heat rise in her cheeks. "They're just fantasies, make-believe." "No," Marcus said firmly. "They're more than that. They're about hope and courage and the parts of being human that matter most. The warrior princess who jumped off the cliff, she's about having faith when there's no reason to have it. The sailor who learned whale songs, he's about listening to voices nobody else bothers to hear." He leaned forward slightly. "You think I don't understand what you're doing out there every day? You're jumping off your own cliff, Marianne. You're telling your stories even though this whole town acts like you're invisible. That takes more courage than most folks will ever have." She stared at him, this wild mountain man with his rough hands and gentle eyes, and felt something shift inside her like a key turning in a lock. They talked through 2 bowls of stew each, and when Marcus finally walked her back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Will you be in town long?" Marianne asked, not wanting the evening to end. "Was planning to head back up tomorrow," Marcus said, "but I could stay a few more days." "If you've got more stories to tell." "I always have more stories," Marianne said softly. "Then I'll stay." Over the next week a pattern emerged. Marianne would tell her stories from the crate each afternoon. Marcus would listen from his bench, and afterward they would share a meal and talk until the light faded. She learned that he was 28 to her 24, that he'd grown up on a farm in Missouri, that his parents were still alive, but he hadn't seen them in years. He learned that she loved coffee more than tea, that she'd once wanted to write novels but had never quite found the courage, that she was afraid of horses but fascinated by wolves. "You should come up to the cabin sometime," Marcus said on the 7th evening. They were walking along the Arkansas River, watching the water catch the last of the daylight. "There are wolves in the high country. You could see them from a safe distance." Marianne's heart skipped. That wouldn't be proper. An unmarried woman visiting a man's home alone. "No," Marcus agreed. "I suppose it wouldn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Marianne, I need to head back up the mountain soon. I've already stayed longer than I should have, but I don't want to stop hearing your stories." "I don't want to stop telling them," she whispered. "Not to you." He turned to face her, his large hands hovering near her shoulders as though he wanted to touch her but wasn't sure he should. "I'm not a town man. I don't know fancy words or proper courting. I live rough, and my cabin's nothing special. But these past days with you, they've been the best I've known in longer than I can count." "Marcus," Marianne breathed. "I'm saying this poorly," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "What I mean is, would you consider letting me court you proper? I could come down from the mountain more often. Once a week, maybe. I could listen to your stories and we could have our meals together, and I could try to show you that even a rough man can treat a woman the way she deserves." Marianne felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I would like that very much." The smile that broke across Marcus's bearded face transformed him. He looked younger, less weathered, and when he carefully took her hand in his much larger one, Marianne felt safer than she had since her parents died. But the next morning brought trouble. Marianne had just climbed onto her crate when she saw 3 men approaching. They were railroad workers, still dirty from their shift, and they were drunk despite the early hour. The tallest one, a man with a scar across his cheek, planted himself directly in front of her. "Tell us a story, princess," he said, his words slurred. His companions laughed. Marianne's mouth went dry, but she lifted her chin. "I tell stories for those who want to listen, not for those who want to mock." "Oh, we want to listen," Scarface said. "We want to hear all about your fairy tales and magic kingdoms. Don't we, boys?" The other two agreed loudly. A small crowd was gathering, but nobody moved to help. This was entertainment, Marianne realized with a sick feeling. After months of ignoring her, the town was finally paying attention, and it was only to watch her humiliation. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "there was a girl who didn't know when to shut her mouth." Scarface grinned. "Now that's a story I can believe." "She talked and talked," Marianne continued, "and foolish men thought that meant she was weak. But what they didn't know was that her words were weapons sharper than any blade, and her courage was forged from the same fire that makes steel." "Big words for a little woman," Scarface said, reaching for her arm. His hand never made contact. Marcus was suddenly there, moving faster than a man his size should have been able to move. He caught Scarface's wrist in one massive hand and squeezed. The railroad worker yelped and tried to pull away, but Marcus held him effortlessly. "The lady's telling a story," Marcus said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it, like ice over a deep river. "You're being rude." "This ain't your business, mountain man," one of the other railroad workers said, trying to sound brave. Marcus looked at him, and the man took an involuntary step backward. "It became my business when you decided to bother her. Now you've got 2 choices. You can apologize to Miss Kendrick and walk away, or you can push this further and find out what happens when you anger a man who wrestles bears for entertainment." "You don't wrestle bears," Scarface said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Sure I do," Marcus said mildly. "Black bears, mostly. Grizzlies when I'm feeling ambitious. Want to test whether I'm lying." He released Scarface's wrist and stood to his full height, his shoulders blocking out the sun. The 3 railroad workers looked at each other, then at Marcus, then at the crowd that was watching with fascination. "Crazy woman ain't worth the trouble anyway," Scarface muttered. He and his friends backed away, trying to salvage some dignity, then turned and hurried off down the street. Marcus turned to Marianne, and the dangerous edge vanished from his expression. "You all right?" She was trembling, but she nodded. "Thank you. Finish your story," Marcus said gently. "I want to hear how it ends." Marianne looked at the crowd that had gathered. They were all watching her now, really watching, maybe for the first time. She took a breath and continued. "The girl with the sharp words and the forged courage stood her ground," she said. "And beside her stood a warrior who understood that true strength isn't about intimidation or cruelty. It's about protecting those who need protection and standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to walk away." Together, they showed the foolish men that kindness is not weakness, and that anyone who mistakes gentleness for an invitation to harm will learn a hard lesson indeed. She finished the story, climbed down from her crate, and walked away with Marcus beside her. Behind them, the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves. "Do you really wrestle bears?" Marianne asked when they were alone. Marcus grinned. "I've fought off a few when they got too interested in my traps, but I might have exaggerated slightly about it being entertainment." Despite everything, Marianne laughed. That afternoon, something changed in Pueblo. Maybe it was the way Marcus had stood up for her, or maybe people had simply grown curious despite themselves. But when Marianne took her place the next day, a few people actually stopped to listen. Just a handful at first, then a few more. By the end of the week, she had a regular audience of perhaps 20 people who would gather to hear her stories. Marcus stayed in town for 2 more weeks, the longest he'd been away from his cabin in years. He listened to every story, walked Marianne home every evening, and courted her with a sweet awkwardness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. He brought her wildflowers from the foothills, taught her to identify animal tracks in the mud by the river, and told her stories of his own about life in the high country. But eventually, he had to return to the mountains. "Winter comes early up there," he explained as they sat by the river on his last evening in town. "I need to get my traps set and lay in supplies before the first snow, but I'll come back down in 2 weeks, sooner if I can manage it." 2 weeks feels like forever," Marianne said, then felt foolish for admitting it. Marcus took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I know, but I'll think about you every day. About your stories and your laugh and the way you stand on that crate like you're queen of the whole territory." "I'll miss you," Marianne whispered. "I'll miss you too." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in leather. "I made this for you. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember me by while I'm gone." Marianne unwrapped the leather to find a small carved figure. It was a woman standing on what might have been a cliff or a crate, her arms spread wide as though she were about to fly. The detail was incredible, every fold of her dress visible, her face turned upward toward an invisible sky. "Marcus," she breathed, "this is beautiful. You made this. Long winter nights in the cabin I carved to pass the time," he said, looking embarrassed. "Usually just animals and such, but I wanted to make something special for you. It's the warrior princess from your first story, the one who jumped." Marianne looked up at him, this massive mountain man who listened to fairy tales and carved delicate figures and made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. "I love it," she said. "I'll treasure it always." Marcus leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't want to. His lips brushed against hers, soft despite the rough beard, and Marianne felt the kiss all the way down to her toes. It was gentle and sweet and over far too quickly. 2 weeks, Marcus promised against her hair. "I'll be back in 2 weeks." He left at dawn the next morning, his pack loaded with supplies, heading up into the mountains that Marianne could see from her window at the boarding house. She watched until he disappeared into the pine forests, then went to tell her stories with the carved princess tucked safely in her pocket. The 2 weeks passed slowly. Marianne's audience continued to grow, and she found herself enjoying the telling more now that people were actually listening. She met a young woman named Sarah who loved the romantic stories best, and a grizzled prospector who always requested tales of adventure and treasure. Even Mrs. Patterson admitted that having a local storyteller was rather charming in its way. But Marianne counted the days until Marcus would return. He arrived on the 14th day exactly, riding down from the mountains on a sturdy bay horse with a pack mule trailing behind. Marianne was in the middle of a story about a clockmaker who could build time itself when she saw him, and she nearly lost her place from pure joy. She finished the tale as quickly as she could, climbed down from her crate, and hurried to where Marcus was tying his horse outside the livery stable. He turned at her approach, and the smile on his face made her heart soar. "I missed you," he said simply. "I missed you too." Marianne wanted to throw herself into his arms but was acutely aware of the watching townspeople. "How was the journey?" "Long," Marcus said. "But worth it to see you again. I've been storing up my own stories to tell you. Saw a mother wolf with her cubs, and a golden eagle took a rabbit not 20 feet from where I was standing. The aspens are starting to turn gold up high." They fell into their old pattern as though the 2 weeks had never happened. Stories and meals and long walks by the river. But there was a new intensity to their time together, an awareness that Marcus would have to leave again, and the separations would only get harder. On the third evening, as they sat on a bench outside the post office watching the stars emerge, Marcus turned to Marianne with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us and about the future. I know we haven't been courting long, but I'm not getting any younger, and I know my own mind. Marianne, I love you. I love your stories and your courage and the way you see magic in everything. I love that you're not afraid to be different, even when it would be easier to fit in." Marianne's breath caught. "I'm not rich," Marcus continued. "I can't offer you a fine house in town or servants or the kind of life you probably grew up with in Boston. But I can offer you a cabin in the most beautiful place you've ever seen, and a man who will spend every day trying to make you happy, and a life where you can tell your stories to your heart's content. I can offer you my whole heart, because you already own it whether you want it or not." He slid off the bench and onto one knee and pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "Marianne Kendrick, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Marianne's face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Marcus stood and swept her into his arms, lifting her clear off the ground as he kissed her. Marianne laughed against his mouth, dizzy with happiness, and when he finally set her down, she saw that several townspeople had stopped to watch. For once, she didn't mind the attention. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. Marianne wore a simple blue dress that she'd made herself, and Marcus wore clean buckskins and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. Mrs. Patterson stood as witness along with the prospector who loved adventure stories, and the preacher pronounced them man and wife in front of a surprisingly large gathering of Pueblo residents. "I suppose we've become local celebrities," Marianne whispered to Marcus as they walked out of the church into the September sunshine. "You're the celebrity," Marcus said. "I'm just the lucky fool who had the sense to listen." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the room that Marianne had called home for the past 8 months. Marcus was gentle and patient, and Marianne discovered that physical love could be as beautiful as the love in her stories. When she woke the next morning wrapped in her husband's arms, she felt like the princess who had jumped off the cliff and discovered she could fly. But now came the hard part. Marcus's cabin was a 3-day journey into the mountains, accessible only on horseback or on foot. Marianne would have to leave behind everything she couldn't carry, including her storytelling crate and the small audience she'd built in Pueblo. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked as they prepared to leave. "It's not too late to change your mind. We could try to find a way to make it work, me coming down more often, or maybe we could build a place closer to town." Marianne looked at her husband, this strong, gentle man who had listened when no one else would. "I'm sure," she said. "My stories don't need a town or a crate. They just need someone who wants to hear them. And I have that in you." They set out on a crisp October morning, Marianne riding behind Marcus on the bay horse, her few possessions packed on the mule. The journey was difficult for someone who had never spent much time on horseback, but Marcus was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest and pointing out landmarks along the way. "That peak there, that's Mount Shivano," he said as they climbed higher into the mountains. And those are the collegiate peaks beyond. In summer, the wildflowers up here are so thick you can barely see the ground. The higher they climbed, the more Marianne understood what Marcus loved about this place. The air was thin and clean, scented with pine and alpine flowers. Streams tumbled down rocky slopes, and when they camped the second night, Marianne saw more stars than she had ever imagined existed. "It's like someone spilled diamonds across black velvet," she whispered, staring up at the Milky Way. Marcus pulled her close, sharing his warmth in the cold mountain night. "Wait until you see the northern lights. They come through sometimes in winter, colors dancing across the sky like nothing you can describe." They reached the cabin on the afternoon of the third day, and Marianne's first thought was that it was much nicer than she'd expected. It was built from sturdy logs, chinked tight against the weather, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost Marcus a fortune to haul up the mountain. Inside, there was a main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom, and a loft for storage. Simple furniture that Marcus had built himself, furs on the floor, shelves lined with supplies. "It's wonderful," Marianne said honestly. "It feels like a home." Over the next weeks, she made it even more so. She unpacked her books and arranged them on a shelf. She hung curtains in the windows and made bread in the Dutch oven, and learned how to cook over an open fire. Marcus taught her to recognize the signs of changing weather and how to tell direction by the sun and stars. She taught him poetry and read to him in the evenings while he worked on his traps and carved small figures, and she told him stories. Every single day, Marianne would spin new tales while Marcus listened with that same focused attention he'd given her in Pueblo. Sometimes she told them while they worked, her voice accompanying the rhythm of churning butter or mending clothes. Sometimes she told them in the evening by firelight, dramatic tales that made Marcus laugh or lean forward with anticipation. Sometimes she whispered them in the darkness of their bedroom, soft stories about love and belonging that made her husband hold her closer. Winter came early to the high country, just as Marcus had predicted. The first snow fell in late October, and by November they were snowed in for days at a time. But Marianne didn't mind. She had her husband, her books, and an endless supply of stories. Marcus checked his trap lines when the weather permitted and kept them supplied with fresh meat. They were entirely self-sufficient, alone in their mountain kingdom. One evening in December, as a blizzard howled outside and they sat wrapped in furs by the fire, Marcus asked Marianne to tell him how they'd met. "But you were there," she said, laughing. "You know how we met." "I want to hear it as a story," Marcus said, "the way you'd tell it to someone else." So Marianne told the story of the woman who told stories to empty air and the mountain man who stopped to listen. She made it grand and romantic, adding details and emotions that made the experience richer than the simple facts. When she finished, Marcus was looking at her with such love that it made her breath catch. "That's how I'll always remember it," he said. "Exactly like that." Winter deepened, and Marianne discovered she was pregnant. She told Marcus on a January morning when the sun was bright on new snow and the world looked like it had been carved from crystal. "A baby," Marcus's eyes went wide. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," Marianne said. "Mrs. Patterson told me the signs to watch for before I left Pueblo. I should have the baby sometime in late summer." Marcus picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We're going to be parents. We're going to have a family." He became even more protective after that, insisting that Marianne rest more and take on fewer chores. She indulged him because she knew it came from love, but she also insisted on maintaining her independence. She could still cook and clean and tell stories, pregnancy or not. As winter gave way to spring, Marianne's belly grew round with their child. Marcus talked to the baby constantly, telling it about the mountains and the animals and all the things they would do together when it was old enough. Marianne told stories to her unborn child, tales of adventure and wonder that she hoped would shape the person growing inside her. They decided to head down to Pueblo in late June, well before the baby was due. Marianne wanted to be near a doctor when her time came, and Marcus agreed despite his general distrust of towns. They made the journey slowly, Marcus incredibly careful on the mountain trails, and reached Pueblo in early July. Mrs. Patterson was delighted to see them and insisted they stay at the boarding house for as long as they needed. The town had changed slightly in the months since Marianne left. There was a new school being built, and someone had started a small lending library. Several people stopped Marianne on the street to say they missed her stories. "You should tell one while you're here," Sarah, the young woman who loved romances, suggested. "Just like old times." So Marianne climbed back onto her crate in front of the mercantile, her belly round with pregnancy, and told a story about a mother bear teaching her cubs to fish in a mountain stream. Marcus stood nearby, watching with a proud smile, and a crowd gathered just like they used to. When she finished, people actually applauded. The baby came on August 15, 1879, after a long labor that had Marcus pacing the boarding house hallway like a caged mountain lion. When the doctor finally emerged to tell him he had a son, Marcus nearly knocked the man over in his rush to get to Marianne. She was exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Marcus approached almost timidly, as though afraid his large hands might break something so small and precious. But when Marianne placed the baby in his arms, he held their son with surprising gentleness. "He's perfect," Marcus whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never quite decided. Looking at her husband holding their son, Marianne knew exactly what felt right. "Matthew," she said. "Matthew Vance. It means gift of God, and he is exactly that." "Matthew," Marcus repeated, testing the name. "I like it." Matthew Vance. Welcome to the world. They stayed in Pueblo for 6 weeks while Marianne recovered, and Matthew grew strong enough for the journey to the cabin. During that time, Marianne told stories in the evenings, holding her nursing son while Marcus sat close beside her. She told tales about families and belonging, about the fierce love of parents for their children, about the magic of new beginnings. In October, when the aspens were turning gold and the air had the first bite of coming winter, they returned to the mountains. Matthew made the journey bundled against Marianne's chest, sleeping peacefully as the horse climbed higher into the peaks. Life in the cabin changed with a baby. Sleep became a precious commodity, and Marianne's days were filled with feeding and changing and soothing. But she still told her stories, now with Matthew as part of her audience. Marcus would hold their son while Marianne cooked dinner, telling the baby elaborate tales about brave knights and clever princesses. Marianne would nurse Matthew while describing magical kingdoms where children were cherished above all treasures. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winter snows gave way to spring wildflowers, which bloomed into summer abundance before autumn painted the mountains gold and crimson. Matthew grew from baby to toddler to a sturdy little boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Marcus taught him to track animals and identify plants, while Marianne taught him letters and numbers and filled his head with stories. When Matthew was 3, Marianne discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the baby came in the cabin with only Marcus to help, a squalling daughter born during a spring thunderstorm. They named her Margaret, and she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's love of words. The cabin grew more crowded but also more full of love. Marcus built additional rooms and furniture sized for small children. Marianne told stories every evening after dinner, with Matthew and Margaret curled against her and Marcus working on some carving or mending nearby. The children grew up on tales of wonder, and both inherited their mother's imagination. When Matthew was 7 and Margaret was 4, they made their first trip as a family down to Pueblo. The town had grown considerably, and Marianne barely recognized it. The railroad had expanded, bringing more people and commerce. The school she'd seen being built was now operating with 2 teachers. The lending library had become a proper institution. "You should tell a story," Marcus suggested, "for old time's sake." Marianne hadn't stood on her crate in years, but when someone found it stored in the mercantile and set it up in the street, she climbed up with her daughter on her hip and her son standing beside her. She told a story about a family of foxes learning to survive in the mountains, and the crowd that gathered was 10 times the size she'd ever attracted before. Afterward, a well-dressed woman approached her. "Miss Kendrick, or I suppose it's Mrs. Vance now, I'm Helen Morrison. I'm on the board of the new library. We've been hoping to start a weekly story hour for the children of Pueblo. Would you consider coming down from the mountains once a month to tell your tales?" Marianne looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragement. "I think I could manage that," she said. So a new pattern emerged. Once a month during the warmer seasons, the Vance family would make the journey to Pueblo. Marianne would tell stories at the library to crowds of enchanted children and adults, while Marcus handled business, and the children played with town kids their age. They would stay a few days, then return to their mountain home. It was the best of both worlds. Marianne had her stories and her audience, but she also had the wild beauty of the high country and the family she loved. Marcus had his mountains and his traps, but he also had regular contact with civilization and the knowledge that his wife was sharing her gift with others. More children came. A second son they named Martin, born when Matthew was 9. Twin girls, Melissa and Molly, born 3 years after that. The cabin expanded until it was almost a proper house, with multiple bedrooms and a larger main room where the whole family could gather. Marianne's storytelling became legendary throughout southern Colorado. People would travel from other towns to hear her monthly performances in Pueblo. She was offered money, but she always refused, saying that stories were gifts meant to be shared freely. Some of her tales were written down and published in regional newspapers, spreading further than she'd ever imagined, but her favorite audience remained her family. Every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, Marianne would gather her children and her husband and tell them a story. Sometimes they were new tales, fresh from her imagination. Sometimes they were old favorites that the children requested again and again. Sometimes they were true stories about their own family, about how a lonely storyteller had found a mountain man who listened, and how that listening had transformed both their lives. Matthew grew into a young man as strong and solid as his father, more comfortable in the mountains than in town. Margaret had her mother's way with words and started writing her own stories. Martin was quiet and observant, with a talent for drawing the animals and landscapes around them. The twins were wild and joyful, always laughing, always moving, bringing chaos and delight in equal measure. On a crisp autumn evening when Matthew was 18 and preparing for his first winter running trap lines with his father, Marianne sat by the fire with Marcus and looked at the life they'd built together. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Marrying a strange woman who told stories on a crate?" Marcus laughed, the sound deep and warm. "Best decision I ever made. You gave me everything, Marianne. A family, a purpose beyond just surviving, a reason to appreciate the beauty around us instead of just enduring it." "You gave me just as much," Marianne said softly. You were the first person who truly listened, who saw value in my stories instead of seeing them as foolishness. You gave me permission to be exactly who I am." "You always had permission," Marcus said. "You just needed someone to acknowledge it." The children came bursting in then, the twins arguing about something, Martin trying to mediate, Margaret laughing at all of them. Matthew followed more sedately, carrying firewood. The moment of quiet intimacy ended, but Marianne didn't mind. This noise, this chaos, this overwhelming love, it was all part of the story too. As the years continued to pass, Marianne watched her children grow and find their own paths. Matthew stayed in the mountains, eventually building his own cabin a few miles from his parents' place. He married a tough, capable woman from Pueblo named Rachel, and they started their own family. Margaret moved to Denver to work for a newspaper, writing articles and stories that reached audiences across the West. Martin became a portrait artist whose paintings of Colorado life were exhibited in galleries. The twins, inseparable as always, opened a general store in Pueblo and ran it with efficiency and charm. Marianne continued her monthly storytelling sessions in Pueblo well into her 50s, only stopping when arthritis made the journey too difficult. By then, Margaret had compiled many of her mother's stories into a book that sold throughout Colorado and beyond. Marianne Kendrick Vance became known as the mother of mountain tales, her stories preserving a way of life and a sense of wonder that was rapidly disappearing as the West became more settled and civilized. Marcus's hair turned gray, then white, but he remained strong and vital well into his 60s. He still ran trap lines in winter, though Matthew did most of the heavy work now. He still carved small figures in the evenings, and Marianne's shelves were crowded with wooden animals and people, each one a tiny masterpiece. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration in Pueblo. The whole town seemed to turn out, along with people from surrounding communities. There were speeches and toasts, and Marianne was presented with a beautiful leather-bound journal for writing down more stories. "I can't believe how much life can change in 30 years," Marianne said that evening as she and Marcus sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stars emerge. "When I first came to Pueblo, I was so lost. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake leaving Boston." "And now?" Marcus asked, though he was smiling. "Now I know it was the best thing I ever did. Every choice, every difficult moment, it all led me here. To you, to our children, to a life richer than any story I could have invented." Marcus took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "You know what I think? I think we've been writing our own story all along, the storyteller and the mountain man. It's a good one, don't you think?" "The best one," Marianne agreed. They had grandchildren now, 11 of them scattered between their various children, and Marianne told stories to this new generation just as she had to their parents. She would sit in her rocking chair by the fire, a grandchild on each knee and more scattered at her feet, and spin tales of magic and adventure. The children listened with the same rapt attention their grandfather had shown their grandmother all those years ago in Pueblo, proving that some gifts pass down through blood and love. Marcus built cradles and small chairs for each grandchild, carving their names into the wood along with animals or flowers that suited their personalities. He taught the older ones to track and hunt and respect the mountains, passing down knowledge that his own father had taught him decades ago in Missouri. When Marianne was 60, she published a second book, this one a memoir of life in the Colorado high country. It included stories of raising children in isolation, of the beauty and harshness of mountain winters, of the deep satisfaction of a life lived on one's own terms. It also included the story of how she'd met Marcus, told exactly the way she'd told it to him by firelight all those years ago. The book was successful beyond anyone's expectations. Copies sold throughout America, and Marianne received letters from readers as far away as New York and California. Women wrote to thank her for showing that there were many ways to live a fulfilling life. Mothers wrote about sharing her stories with their children. Men wrote about the reminder that true strength includes gentleness, and that listening is as important as speaking. But Marianne's favorite letters came from other storytellers, people who had been told their imagination was foolish or their tales were wastes of time. They thanked her for persisting, for standing on that crate day after day even when no one listened, for proving that eventually the right audience would find you if you were brave enough to keep speaking your truth. "You inspired a lot of people," Marcus said one evening, reading through the latest batch of correspondence. "We inspired them," Marianne corrected. "You were the one who chose to listen. That's just as important as the telling. I guess we make a good team." "The best team," Marianne said, kissing his weathered cheek. They grew old together in their mountain home, their children and grandchildren visiting regularly. Their lives intertwined so completely that neither could imagine existing without the other. Marcus's strength gradually faded, his steps becoming slower, his breathing more labored in the thin mountain air. Marianne's hands grew too arthritic for writing, but she could still tell stories, and she did so constantly, filling their cabin with words and wonder. On a spring morning in 1911, when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom and the aspens were budding green, Marcus died peacefully in his sleep with Marianne beside him. He was 71 years old and had lived to see his children successful and happy, his grandchildren thriving, and his wife celebrated throughout the West for her storytelling gifts. Marianne grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, and in the stories Marcus had loved. She told the tale of their meeting over and over, keeping his memory alive in words and wonder. She described his gentleness and strength, his patience and protection, the way he had listened when no one else would. She lived another 8 years, spending her final winters in Pueblo with the twins and her summers in the mountain cabin with Matthew and his family. She continued telling stories until just days before her death, her voice growing softer but never losing its magic. Marianne Kendrick Vance died in the summer of 1919, surrounded by her children and many of her grandchildren. Her last words were the beginning of a story. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who had stories to tell and a man who had ears to hear them, and together they built a life more beautiful than any fairy tale." She was buried beside Marcus in a small cemetery near their cabin, high in the Colorado mountains they had both loved. Their grave was marked with a simple stone that bore both their names and a single line: "The Storyteller and the Mountain Man, together always." Their children ensured that Marianne's stories lived on. Margaret published a final collection of her mother's tales, including many that had never been written down before. Martin painted a portrait of his parents as they had been when young, Marianne standing on her crate with Marcus sitting nearby listening, which hung in the Pueblo library for generations. Matthew maintained the cabin as a memorial, and his own grandchildren eventually turned it into a small museum celebrating frontier life and the power of storytelling. Marianne's books remained in print for decades, introducing new generations to her particular brand of magic and wonder. Scholars studied her work as an example of oral tradition and folk storytelling. Teachers used her tales in classrooms across America, and countless parents read her stories to their children at bedtime, passing down the legacy of a woman who had refused to stop speaking even when no one seemed to be listening. The story of how Marianne and Marcus met became a legend in southern Colorado, told and retold until it took on the qualities of the fairy tales Marianne herself had loved. People said it proved that everyone has a story worth telling and that somewhere, someone is waiting to hear it. They said it showed that true love is built on attention and appreciation, on seeing and valuing what others overlook. In Pueblo, a statue was eventually erected in front of the library showing a woman standing on a crate, her arms spread wide as though about to take flight, while a large man sits nearby listening. Generations of children climbed on that statue, and their parents told them about the real people it represented, about courage and stories, and the kind of love that transforms ordinary lives into legend. The storyteller and the mountain man had found each other against all odds, in a place where stories were seen as frivolous and wild men rarely came down from the hills. They had built a life together based on mutual respect and deep affection, raising children who valued both strength and imagination, both wilderness and words. They had shown that it was possible to be true to yourself while also building a family, to honor your gifts while also honoring the land and the people you loved. Their story lived on because it was true in all the ways that mattered. It was true to the human need to be heard and valued. It was true to the power of attention and listening. It was true to the possibility of finding love in unexpected places and building something lasting from seemingly impossible circumstances. And in the end, it was the kind of story Marianne herself would have loved to tell, full of hope and courage and the kind of magic that exists in the real world for those brave enough to seek it. It was a story about a woman who stood on a crate day after day, spinning tales into the indifferent air, until one day a mountain man stopped to listen. It was a story about how that single act of attention changed two lives and echoed through generations. It was, quite simply, a love story. And like all the best love stories, it was true.